Welcome, welcome. We have some presenters from the University of Mississippi. I'll let them introduce themselves, discussing assessment of hydration status of collegiate esports players. So when you are ready, you can start to share your screen, and looking forward to hearing this.
Yeah, we can advance.
And I'm loving the blanket on the table there. Looking good. Setting up nicely. Dr. Andre still not present, huh? All right.
Not present.
Looks like it's loading in here. If you go into presentation mode, we'll get going. All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Trace Dominy, and I'm a PhD student in the exercise science department. This is
I'm Brooke Gilmore. I'm also a PhD student in the nutrition department.
And I'm Morgan Krupp. I'm also a PhD student in the nutrition department.
all right. And we're here today, just as Dr. Jenny said, we're here to talk to you guys about the assessment of hydration status within our collegiate esports players here at the University of Mississippi. Give me 1 second. Having a little technical difficulties here.
May have to hit them.
Here.
Yeah.
Okay, I figured it out. So as most of you know, esports is a competitive gaming or professional leagues that have professional players and amateur players. And they often compete in team settings or individual settings, and they're often competing for prizes or sponsorships with that. Esports is pretty similar to traditional sports in that it encompasses both teamwork, strategy, and fan bases, and it's a massive global market now, with professional and amateur leagues all across the world. In 2023, the global esports market was valued at approximately $1.7 billion. And by 2032, it's supposed to be approximated to be about $9.3 billion. With that said, esports is still a relatively new community, and there's not a ton of physiological research within this group. Most of the research that has been done within esports has been done looking at cardiovascular function, or the influence that gaming has on cardiovascular function. Particularly what we have seen so far is that it's going to increase heart rate and blood pressure, and it's primarily doing this through the release of catecholamines. So that's going to be through our sympathetic nervous system with our release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, and that's going to be increasing our heart rate and blood pressure. And then our parasympathetic nervous system is going to be releasing acetylcholine, which is going to slow this down. We're suppressing the release of acetylcholine there. Most notably, heart rate fluctuations. The highest spikes tend to be during those anticipatory moments right before a gameplay happens, or during high stakes scenarios, particularly when people are playing against other human components versus when they're playing against just regular computer generated components. With that, participation in esports relies heavily upon a player's cognitive ability to complete certain tasks or specific tasks within the game. So that can be anything from strategic and analytical thinking, could be reaction time and accuracy, decision-making speed, hand-eye coordination, precise movements within the game, and then also spatial orientation. So knowing where you are within the game at all times. With that, dehydration has been linked to at certain body mass losses to decrease cognitive performance, which could be detrimental to an esports player. So with that, water is an essential nutrient for us. It accounts for 50 to 70% of the human body and about 75% of the brain. So our brain encompasses both interstitial and intercellular fluid, and it relies heavily upon electrolyte balance for our brain to work optimally. And previous research has quantified dehydration at a body mass loss of 2% or greater, or sometimes you might see it as a serum osmolality of 295 osmos or greater, or a USG greater than 1.020. With that previous research, we have also seen decreases in cognitive ability at that 2% body mass loss as well. So if you're unfamiliar with how we measure hydration status, there are several ways to do it. Some of the more expensive and invasive ways to do it would be serum osmolality or urine osmolality. But again, those require expensive specialized equipment and specialized training. Some of the more practical ways that we can measure it would be through assessment of body mass loss, or here through the assessment of urine-specific gravity. So here we have on our right a urine refractometer, and on our left is the scale within this device that we're using to measure hydration status. So on the left of that scale, from that 1.000 all the way to 1.07, that's how we would assess if somebody is hydrated or not. Essentially what this is doing is this scale is comparing a density of a sample to a sample of distilled water. And so any fluid that is greater than that 1.00 is said to be greater than water. And so essentially it's measuring our particles within our urine, and that's how we're assessing our hydration status. So it's measuring your proteins, your urea, your electrolytes, and glucose, and some other particles as well. And so when we are particularly concerned within our esports population about dehydration, again, it would be more so on that cognitive side. So this was a book chapter that Dickerson et al. Released in 2025, earlier this year, talking about the different ways that dehydration could affect esports players. And primarily the ones that we're concerned with, again, would be our concentration, reaction time, our memory, decision-making speed, attention, and then also mood as well. And so in 2018, Whitborough et al. Did a meta-analysis, and they were particularly interested in finding out if dehydration does or does not impair cognitive performance. And in this, they included 33 studies. So what we're looking at here is a forest plot. We have our mean line down the middle, that dotted line. Anything to the left of that line indicates a negative effect size or an impairment from dehydration. And anything on the right of that line indicates a positive effect size, indicating that they actually improved when they got dehydrated. But what they found here was that 73% of the studies had a negative effect size, indicating that they were negatively impacted by dehydration at that 2% body mass loss. However, 27% of the studies found that there was they either had no effect or even an improvement at that 2% body mass loss. But overall, the main finding from this meta-analysis was that the dehydration looked at a small but significant effect at that 2% body mass loss in terms of cognitive performance. However, more interestingly, from this meta-analysis, they wanted to break it down from cognitive domains. So again, we're looking at this forest plot. Left side, again, is going to indicate a negative impairment. Right side is going to be that positive improvement at that dehydration. So at the top of this forest plot, we have our top order, our attention domain. The middle, we have our motor coordination domain. And then at the bottom, we have our reaction time specific domain. And so what they found was that task assessing attention and executive function and motor coordination were negatively impacted from dehydration at that 2% body mass loss. But cognitive domains assessing reaction time and memory were not affected at a 2% body mass loss. And so the authors here kind of proposed that some of our higher order cognitive domains might be more negatively affected from dehydration compared to some of our lower order level tasks, such as reaction time. However, to our knowledge and to the author's knowledge, there hasn't been a for sure proposed mechanism for why this is occurring. So when we start to talk about dehydration within the esports population, there's only been one study so far that has directly assessed hydration status within esports players. And this study was by Ribeiro et al. In 2024. They assessed the hydration status of 98 esports players during a live competition. And the main finding they found from this was that 60.2% of the players there were significantly dehydrated. And so while the brain is capable for compensating for fluid limitations for a short period of time, it might not be you might not be able to require that sustained mental effort that esports does for longer periods as they're playing.
And so with this, we have our problem statement. So with that, only one study has been assessing the hydration status of these esports players, and no study has also assessed the hydration status over the course of multiple visits. So with this, we have our purpose. The purpose of this study was to assess the daily hydration status and also nutritional intake of collegiate esports players. For our methods, we had 7 participants from the University of Mississippi varsity esports team that ended up participating in this study. The inclusion criteria for this was that they must be a member of the University of Mississippi's esports team, and that they must be a varsity esports player as well. So for our first visit, we had the players come in, they provided informed consent, and then they filled out the fluid intake questionnaire. Following that, we had them complete a 24-hour diet recall. They then filled out the thirst visual analog scale, and then they provided us with a urine sample. And then for the second, or visits 2 through 5, they then came back in and they filled out the thirst visual analog scale and then provided us with another urine sample as well for these visits. So this is that fluid intake questionnaire. They answered all of the questions on this, questions such as, please write in the average daily amount of beverages that you consume, about how many ounces they're consuming of fluid overall on a daily basis, how many times they urinate per day, and a few other questions on here as well, just to assess the overall fluid intake of these esports players. And then this is that thirst visual analog scale. So on this scale on a piece of paper, they're just marking about how thirsty they are on a scale of 0 to 10. And then this is then measured with a measuring device there. And then for the urine samples, we had them urinate, provide us with a sample. We then measured that urine-specific gravity using the refractometer, and we were able to measure this for each of the participants at each time of visit. For the 24-hour diet recall, this was done through the ASA 24 diet intake. And then each participant, they went in, they provided us with the past 24 hours, every single item that they ate for each meal, each snack, and then also how many fluids that they were drinking. And then this was then measured through that device online. And then lastly, for our statistical analysis, we used that Pearson R correlation conducted to determine the relationship between the urine-specific gravity, thirst, and also daily fluid intake, with that significance of a p-value less than 0.05. Pass back over to Trace.
All right, so table 1 here, we're just going to point out a couple of things too. This is just looking at our average USG, thirst, and daily fluid intake. So just to point out a couple of things. Our average USG is at 1.026. And the way that we defined that in our study was that was moderately dehydrated for us. So our average was moderately dehydrated. And then secondly, our daily fluid intake was about 73 fluid ounces per day. Figure 1 here, we're looking at relationship between USG and daily fluid intake. So on our y-axis, we have our USG, and our x-axis, we have our daily fluid intake. And we actually had a strong negative relationship here, indicating that the more fluid that the individual is consuming per day, the less their USG is and the more hydrated they are as well. And then for figure 2, we're looking at the relationship between USG and thirst. So on our y-axis again, we have our USG, and our x-axis we have our thirst. And what we found here that there was pretty much no association here between USG and thirst, indicating that it might not matter how thirsty you are and their hydration level there. So when we start to look at previous studies, we can look here again at Rivera et al. In 2024. Their mean USG was 1.020, right at that cusp of dehydration, of course. However, they defined their dehydration range a little bit differently than we did. They had said anything from 1.100 to 1.020 was considered dehydrated, whereas for us, anything greater than 1.020 was considered dehydrated, indicating that we might have some differences there. Secondly, there was a study by Blope et al. In 2009 that wanted to assess the hydration status of a number of athletes across the university. There was over 200 participants in the study. And essentially what they found here was that 66% of the athletes pre-practice were dehydrated, which is pretty similar to that 60% of our esports athletes in that Rivera et al. Study as well. And then when we break it down from our study here, we found that total dehydrated of our population, the total number of urine samples that we got of 23 was 91%. Again, our sample size is much smaller compared to 98 and 263 as the previous studies. And we still need some more data to compare to those studies, but preliminary, it indicates that it's a similar trend and that there might be dehydration associated within this esports population.
All right, so as Brooke mentioned, we collected that 24-hour recall from each of the participants, and from that data, we were able to break down the mean calorie, carbohydrate, fat, and protein intake for the players. Noting that our sample size is rather small and there is a large range for really all of the macronutrients, but we can see mean kcal intake was around 3,500 calories per day, with a standard deviation of around 1,700. Mean carbohydrate intake was at 273. Mean fat intake was 161 grams, and mean protein intake at 127 grams per day. So comparing this to the USDA MyPlate recommendations, which give general dietary and nutrition guidance for the health of populations. So all of these USDA MyPlate recommendations are from that website. And then we have the mean intake from our esports players. So sodium mean intake was at 5,870 milligrams per day, whereas the USDA recommendation is 2,300 milligrams for healthy individuals. Mean added sugar intake among the esports players was 91 grams per day, whereas the USDA recommendation is at 10% of daily calories per day. So based on that mean calorie intake, that calculation would be 76 grams. Mean intake of saturated fat among the esports players was 56 grams per day, and the USDA recommendation here is the same for added sugar, so no more than 10% of daily kcals, which would be 34 grams per day based on the mean calorie intake. And dietary fiber among the esports players was 16.5 grams per day on average. And the recommendation from USDA is 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So that'd be around 42 grams per day. So overall, the pattern is that their dietary intake is really not aligning with these recommendations that we have to promote health. Going over limitations, we of course had a small sample size of 7 participants and 5 that completed the dietary recall. This study was observational in nature. We did not have an intervention, but rather collected some preliminary data that could guide future research in this population. All All right, key takeaways. So the majority of participants were dehydrated at 91%. As we would expect, urine-specific gravity and daily fluid intake had that strong inverse relationship. And dehydration seems to be prevalent in esports players. However, our study did not investigate, and we really don't know about the effect that dehydration that has on esports performance. Overall dietary intake is not in accordance with those guidelines we have to promote health, and similar to dehydration, we don't really know the effect that this poor dietary intake is having on their performance. Areas of future research, so we could assess hydration status in esports players across multiple days, assess estimated urine-specific gravity versus their actual urine-specific gravity, investigate the impact that dehydration does have on specific tasks in esports players and gaming performance, and examine the efficacy of nutrition education interventions in improving nutrition knowledge or nutrition behaviors among esports populations.
And with that, we'd just like to thank our Ole Miss esports team as well, just for letting us, allowing us to come in and conduct some of this data on them. And also, we just like to thank Dr. Andre as well for giving us guidance through this process. But with that, we would just take any questions.
Can you all see the chat, or do you want me to read you the questions?
Yes, sir. We can see the chat.
Right. Yeah, if you want to read the questions in the chat and then give us an answer, and I'll throw some of the questions in the chat.
Okay, cool. So the first question is, any good ideas to relieve stress during competitive games? It's a great question. Just being from an exercise background and standpoint, I think maybe doing some type of maybe exercise before the game, competitive gaming could help to alleviate some type of stress during that. Not really sure from a nutrition side standpoint. Do you guys have any suggestions there?
I guess overall from like a nutrition standpoint, just maybe kind of following your typical daily eating patterns and routines, not throwing yourself off.
Yeah.
Majorly on big competitive game days.
Second question is, how does caffeine impact hydration status, and does it? So caffeine directly is not going to impact how hydrated the individual is necessarily, but what caffeine does, it is a diuretic. So it's going to make you use the restroom more or pee more. In that case, that could end up decreasing your total body mass, which could lead to a greater body mass loss, which could have some impact on it, but directly affecting hydration status, it doesn't, at least to my knowledge, it doesn't seem to affect it at all. And then what are some measures that you would feel would prevent dehydration in students? Is it a fully nutritional issue or an issue of access?
Yeah, I can touch on both of those.
Okay.
As far as overall preventing dehydration in students, I think that kind of understanding maybe what you typically need to drink throughout the day to ensure that you're adequately hydrated throughout the day can be super helpful for this population. Just kind of building out like an overall hydration plan on a daily basis, knowing that you need to consistently drink water throughout the day, and then maybe some other fluids and beverages. And then as far as the nutritional issue versus issue of access, I think that this could it could be potentially both of these. Obviously, with it being a pretty small sample size of only 5 participants, I think that maybe there is a lack of overall nutrition education in this specific population, but then we're also on a college campus, so knowing that maybe we only have more access to more fast food dining options, that could kind of go hand in hand with that issue to access. So I think overall for this one, it's kind of maybe a combination of both.
And then are there any types of things to avoid drinking Probably soda and stuff, I would assume, maybe Morgan.
Yeah, I can
talk
take that. In terms of general health promotion, definitely limiting sugar sweetened beverages is recommended. And we don't want to be consuming excess amounts of caffeine either.
All right, I think I don't see any more questions in the chat here. I'm taking a look. Any other final comments? You know, last words.
Just thank you for having us, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
guess-
you.
I will give you another question. What do you think were the greatest potential limitations of your study or extraneous variables that you weren't able to control that may have impacted your results? We'll put you on the spot with that question.
Yeah, biggest limitation again is that sample size just being super small. Fortunately, we thought we were going to get a lot more help than what we did, and we didn't. And then extraneous variables, a lot of this data was collected towards the end of the semester. So things like stress from just classes that they're in, maybe lack of sleep that they're in as well. And a lot of times the time of day too, because we were only able to come and collect towards the end of the day. And maybe they just weren't staying hydrated throughout the day, and that could lead to maybe some skewness within our data. Whereas if we're able, most of the time with hydration testing, at first kind of void in the morning after that, it's probably a true indication of how hydrated that you typically are. But it's pretty hard to collect some of that data within this population.
Yes, and I feel for you. It is difficult to sample esports samples. So, yeah, good job. Any other final comments before we transition to the next speaker?
No, sir, I think we're good.
All right. We appreciate you all sharing your information. And are you looking to, has this been published or submitted somewhere for publication, or what are your
No,
plans for
sir.
that?
No, sir, it hasn't. I know with the conference here, maybe we thought about trying to submit something here if y'all are open to that.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk down the line about that stuff too.
Yep. We'll be emailing the presenters about the special issue with the Journal of Electronic Gaming and Esports. So
Cool.
if you can stop sharing your screen, we will get set up for the next presentation, which is Brett Chapman, Yorkville University. The weakest link, the greatest opportunity.